Every argument begins long before the first word is spoken. It begins in the mind of the person who approaches you, in their assumptions, in their fears, in the story they tell themselves about being right. Most people don't enter a disagreement searching for truth. They enter searching for validation. They don't want to understand. They want to win. And the tragedy is that they don't realize how fragile their certainty truly is. One push, one crack, one well-placed question, and everything they believe they're defending begins to unravel from the inside. Not because you attacked them, but because their argument was hollow long before you arrived. Your question simply revealed it. The truth is uncomfortable. Most people don't know what they're talking about. They repeat what they've heard, not what they've examined. They defend ideas they never questioned. They cling to positions built on emotion, not evidence. And when someone like you refuses to argue, refuses to get provoked, refuses to react, when instead you calmly present a question they were unprepared to face, their entire structure collapses under its own weight. That's why the right question is more powerful than the harshest counterargument. A counterargument meets resistance. A question bypasses it. Today, you will learn 5 such questions. Subtle, precise, and devastating. They don't overpower people. They expose them. Question 1. What led you to that conclusion? This question reaches deeper than it appears. It does not ask what a person believes. It asks how they arrived there. And that single shift forces them to walk backward through their reasoning, step by step, until they either discover clarity or discover a void. Most people defend conclusions they never consciously built. They inherited them, absorbed them, picked them up from someone influential or from whatever emotion dominated them at the time. So when you ask, what led you to that conclusion? You are asking them to trace a path they never walked intentionally. And the moment they try to follow it, they realize the ground beneath it is unstable. Imagine someone claims with bold certainty, this idea has no chance of working. Rather than justify yourself or argue percentages or defend the plan, you ask, what led you to that conclusion? Now the burden is no longer on you. It shifts entirely to them. They must reveal the chain of thoughts they never organized. And the moment they try to piece it together, contradictions begin to surface. Maybe their reasoning is based on one bad experience. Maybe it's based on fear disguised as logic. Maybe it's based on a story they heard from someone who also didn't examine it. Maybe it isn't based on anything at all. The question doesn't accuse them. It invites them. And invitations reveal truth faster than confrontation ever will. This question also forces emotional arguments into the open. Sometimes people reach conclusions not through reason, but through insecurity, jealousy, resentment, or pride. By asking what led them there, you remove the camouflage. You bring them face to face with motivations they were hiding even from themselves. Some will try to bluff. Some will try to deflect. Some will try to repeat the same sentence louder, as if repetition strengthens truth. But the question sits between you and them like a mirror. They can admit the real reason, or they can expose their inability to explain it. Either way, the argument weakens. There is a deeper power here. When someone begins explaining the steps of their reasoning, they reveal not only the argument, but the architecture of their mind. They show you what they rely on, what they fear, what they assume, and what they ignore. They expose the shortcuts they take, the biases they carry, the gaps in their understanding. And you, quietly listening, gain control of the conversation without ever raising your voice. You become the one who guides the direction. You become the one who decides which thread to pull next. Not aggressively, not forcefully, simply through attention. This question also protects you from manipulation. When someone tries to pressure you with confidence, authority, or emotional dominance, asking, what led you to that conclusion, forces them to slow down. It disrupts the momentum of the attack. It pulls them out of persuasion mode and into reflection mode. And reflection neutralizes manipulation. A manipulator thrives when you react quickly. They lose power when you make them explain themselves. Use this question whenever someone throws a strong opinion at you, whenever they try to shut you down with certainty, whenever they speak with more emotion than evidence, or whenever they try to push you into agreement before you've had time to think. Ask it calmly, patiently, without urgency. Because the real impact of this question is not in what they say next, but in what happens inside them the moment you ask it. It interrupts their rhythm. It forces thought. It forces honesty. It forces awareness. And once awareness enters a conversation, the argument is already half broken. Question 2. What assumption are you relying on? Every argument hides a shadow, a layer beneath the words where the real meaning lives. People rarely notice it because they're too focused on defending their conclusion. They forget that behind every conclusion, there is an assumption, and behind every assumption, a blind spot. When you ask, "What assumption are you relying on?" you point directly into that shadow. You make the invisible visible. And once the hidden assumption is exposed, the entire argument begins to lose its balance. Because no belief is dangerous on its own. What's dangerous is the belief someone holds without realizing it. Most people walk through life assuming the same things they started believing when they were children. That approval equals safety, that disagreement equals threat, that confidence equals truth. They carry these assumptions into adulthood, into relationships, into debates, into decisions. They never test them. They never question them. They never dissect them. And then one day, someone like you looks at them and asks, "What assumption are you relying on?" And their internal world pauses. Their mind backtracks. They try to examine the path they took unconsciously. And it feels like the ground moves beneath them, because they realize they've been standing on a belief they never evaluated. Imagine someone declares, "Success requires following the traditional path." Instead of disagreeing or presenting counterexamples, you say, "What assumption are you relying on?" Now they must confront the hidden layer. Perhaps the assumption that everyone wants the same life, or that the majority is always right, or that risk is irresponsible, or that fulfillment and stability are the same thing. These assumptions were silent until your question dragged them into the light. And silence is where assumptions gain power. Once revealed, they lose it. Assumptions make people feel safe. They create mental shortcuts that prevent complexity. Instead of thinking deeply, the mind says, "This is how things are," and moves on. But the problem with shortcuts is that they remain invisible until challenged. This question forces the person to recognize the scaffolding holding their argument up. Sometimes it's solid. Often it's not. They might realize they assumed universal truths from personal experiences. They might realize they assumed other people think exactly as they do. They might realize they assumed the rules of life are fixed rather than constructed. The moment they see the assumption, the argument begins to shrink. This question also neutralizes emotional reasoning. Fear, insecurity, pride, all of them hide behind assumptions. Someone who says, "You can't trust people," is relying on the assumption that vulnerability guarantees harm. Someone who says, "Things will go wrong," assumes that past disappointment equals future certainty. Someone who says, "That person hates me," assumes intention without evidence. When you ask what assumption they're relying on, you don't attack their emotion, you isolate it. And once isolated, emotion loses its authority. There is something uniquely disarming about this question. People are rarely asked to examine the roots of their beliefs. They're used to defending conclusions, not the soil those conclusions grew in. When you ask about assumptions, you shift the conversation from the surface to the core. You move from reaction to reflection. And reflection dissolves defensiveness. The person begins thinking instead of fighting. They start noticing inconsistencies. They discover their argument wasn't solid. It was wrapped in instinct, guesswork, or cultural conditioning. Consider how often people argue about things they never defined. Success, morality, fairness, loyalty, intelligence, strength, respect. Each person uses the same word but carries a different assumption beneath it. You cannot win a debate when two people are fighting with different definitions. But you can break the debate apart instantly by asking, "What assumption are you relying on when you use that word?" Suddenly, the conversation stops being a clash of conclusions and becomes an exploration of meaning. You transform conflict into clarity. There is also strategic power here. When someone is aggressive, confrontational, or overly confident, this question cuts through their posture. It forces them to justify the belief they thought required no justification. It forces them to see the fragility of their own logic. Not because you disproved them, but because you made them reveal the framework behind their certainty. People can argue against facts. They can argue against opinions. But they cannot argue against the realization that they were assuming something they never examined. Use this question when someone speaks in absolutes, when they moralize, when they generalize, when they claim inevitability, or when they present a belief as universal truth. Ask it when someone tries to pressure you with should, must, or everyone knows. Ask it when someone uses strong emotion as evidence. Ask it when someone tries to trap you in their worldview without explaining how they built it. And as always, your tone matters. Ask calmly. Neutral voice. No sarcasm. No challenge. The purpose is not domination. It is illumination. This question does something more powerful than dismantling arguments. Teaches people to think. It shows them that the strength of a belief is not measured by how loudly it's defended, but by how clearly its foundations can be identified. It trains them to question the autopilot of their mind. And it positions you not as an opponent, but as someone who sees deeper than the surface. You become someone who isn't easily fooled, pressured, or manipulated. Someone who thinks in layers, not impulses. Every argument has hidden roots. Every belief has a silent anchor. When you ask what assumption someone is relying on, you pull that anchor from the seabed. And once the anchor is lifted, the entire ship begins to drift. Not because you pushed it, but because it was never anchored in truth to begin with. Before we continue, take a moment to support this work. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what kind of argument you struggle with the most. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who want clarity instead of chaos. Question 3. What evidence would make you reconsider? This question separates thinkers from believers, clarity from stubbornness, and truth from ego. Most arguments fall apart not because someone changes their mind, but because someone realizes they were never open to change in the first place. When you ask, what evidence would make you reconsider? You expose the mental door they keep locked. Suddenly, the argument isn't about facts anymore. It's about their relationship with truth. There's a quiet brilliance in this question. It doesn't challenge their point. It challenges their flexibility. It forces them to reveal whether they are discussing or defending, exploring or clinging, thinking or reacting. Someone truly interested in truth can always identify what would change their view. Better data, a counterexample, new information, a deeper perspective. But someone who is driven by ego, fear, or identity will say, nothing. And that one word tells you everything you need to know. The conversation is no longer about truth, but about protection. Imagine a person asserts, this idea is doomed. There's no chance it will work. You could argue, list accomplishments, cite statistics, and fight their negativity. But instead, you calmly ask, what evidence would make you reconsider that belief? Now the conversation shifts. They must define what would convince them. They must identify the conditions under which they would accept being wrong. And if they cannot do that, if they say there is no evidence, no scenario, no possibility, then their belief is not a conclusion. It's a shield. This question is also powerful because it forces the person to confront their own bias. When someone admits they wouldn't change their mind no matter what, they reveal that the debate ended before it even began. They reveal that they were seeking validation, not understanding. They reveal that their argument is a fortress built around insecurity. And once they say it out loud, the illusion of certainty dissolves. They hear themselves defending an immovable belief, and something inside them begins to shift, even if they don't admit it in the moment. Consider how this question exposes the difference between confidence and stubbornness. Confidence is open to correction. Confidence seeks truth. Confidence adjusts when new information appears. Stubbornness fears change, resists clarity, and hides behind emotional certainty. When you ask what evidence would make them reconsider, you are holding up a mirror. You are asking them to show whether they are anchored in reason or trapped in pride. Another layer of this question is that it forces people to define the boundaries of their claim. If they say, I'd change my mind if X happened, now you know the criteria. The argument becomes measurable. The discussion gains structure. You move from emotional terrain to logical ground. And once the structure is clear, the instability of their position becomes easier to reveal. They might realize their criteria contradict their original claim. They might realize their standard of evidence is unreasonable. Or they might realize they don't actually know what would convince them, which means their belief has no foundation. People often speak with false conviction because they believe certainty equals strength. But this question reveals that certainty without conditions is weakness disguised as confidence. It exposes belief that cannot be tested, which means it cannot be trusted. And people feel this internally the moment they try to answer the question. Their mind stumbles. Their expression shifts. Their voice hesitates. Because to answer honestly, they must admit the truth about their argument, whether it is built on curiosity or ego. There is also a practical brilliance here. This question slows the conversation down. It interrupts emotional escalation. It forces the brain to shift from reaction to reflection. And reflection is the enemy of impulsive arguments. When someone pauses to think about what would change their mind, their emotional surge crashes. Their defensiveness weakens. Their certainty softens. You aren't attacking them. You're encouraging them to think, something very few people do in the heat of disagreement. Use this question when someone insists they are absolutely right, when they try to control the narrative with confidence, when they dismiss your perspective without listening, or when they use intensity as a substitute for logic. Ask it when someone makes bold predictions, sweeping judgments, or moral declarations. Ask it when you sense they're more attached to being right than to discovering what is right. And ask it with patience, calm voice, neutral expression, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. The effectiveness of this question depends on your calmness. Strong emotion on your part will activate their defenses, but stillness disarms them. It creates an atmosphere where thinking becomes easier than resisting. When someone answers this question honestly, the argument transforms. You move from collision to cooperation. You identify the path toward clarity. You discover common ground. You open the possibility of agreement. And if they refuse to answer, if they claim no evidence could ever change their mind, then you have already won. Not by defeating them, but by revealing that the argument was never real. An argument without openness is not an argument. It is theater. And the moment you ask what evidence would make them reconsider, the curtain falls. The performance ends. What remains is truth and silence. Question 4. How would this look from the opposite perspective? This question is one of the most disruptive tools you can use in any argument, because it forces a person to step outside themselves, something far more difficult than most people admit. Arguments survive because people stay inside their own viewpoint, inside the version of reality that feels familiar, safe, and morally correct. But every belief has an opposite. Every position has a mirror. And when you ask someone to look through that mirror, their certainty begins to weaken. Not because you attacked them, but because you expanded the frame they were trying to shrink. Most people defend ideas the same way they defend their identity. Rigidly, emotionally, and without questioning the lens they're using. They assume their interpretation is obvious, universal, and unquestionable. But when you gently ask, how would this look from the opposite perspective? You create a fracture in that mental rigidity. And through that fracture, clarity begins to enter. They are forced to imagine a reality where their belief is not the default truth, but one possibility among many. For some people, that alone is enough to destabilize their argument. Imagine someone claims, "This policy is unfair. It hurts people like me." Rather than argue or justify the policy, you say, how would this look from the opposite perspective, from someone who benefits from it, or someone who sees fairness differently? Now you've shifted the terrain. They must acknowledge that fairness depends on viewpoint, context, and definition. They must recognize that their position isn't universal truth. It's a perspective shaped by experience, background, and emotion. They must realize that the world is larger than the corner they stand in. And that realization alone weakens the power of their initial claim. This question is particularly effective because it bypasses defensiveness. You are not saying they're wrong. You're not challenging their integrity or intelligence. You're simply asking them to widen their field of vision. This disarms resistance because curiosity does not trigger the ego the way confrontation does. When you ask them to take another perspective, You're guiding them, not opposing them. And people rarely resist guidance delivered calmly and without threat. There is also a psychological mechanism at play. Most arguments depend on narrow framing. The smaller the frame, the stronger the illusion of certainty. When someone views a disagreement only through their lens, the story feels simple. They feel justified. But once you expand the frame, once they must imagine how someone else experiences the same situation, the simplicity disappears. The emotional charge weakens. The certainty becomes blurry. And they begin to see the distance between what they believe and what they can prove. This question also reveals how deeply someone understands their own argument. If they truly grasp the issue, they'll be able to articulate the opposing view clearly. They'll be able to show empathy, nuance, and intellectual flexibility. But if they cannot describe the opposite perspective, if they misrepresent it or dismiss it, then their argument loses credibility. You discover instantly whether they are informed or merely opinionated, whether they are thinkers or defenders, whether they are grounded or reactive. Consider a person who says, "My approach is the only rational one." Ask them how the opposite approach might appear rational to someone else. Watch their expression shift. Watch them realize that calling something the only rational option is not logic, it's ego. Or imagine someone says, "Anyone who disagrees is ignorant." Ask them to imagine what the disagreement looks like from the other side. Now they must confront the truth they were avoiding. Disagreement doesn't equal ignorance. It equals diversity of experience. And acknowledging this forces them to rethink the confidence they wore like armor. This question also exposes hidden biases. When someone tries to adopt the opposite perspective, they often discover the assumptions that shaped their original one. They notice what they previously ignored. They confront the blind spots they didn't know they had. And once a blind spot becomes visible, the argument loses the illusion of absolute certainty. They might not admit it aloud, but they feel it. The argument is no longer a weapon. It has become a question mark. Use this question when someone is absolutist, when they moralize, when they speak as if their perspective is the only possible one. Use it when someone refuses to consider nuance, when they reduce complex issues to black and white, when they claim exclusivity over truth. And use it when you sense they're stuck inside their own narrative, unable or unwilling to imagine anything beyond it. Your tone here matters immensely. Ask with calm curiosity, not with challenge. If it sounds like a trap, their mind will close. If it sounds like an invitation, their mind will open. The power of this question lies not in forcing them to accept another viewpoint, but in encouraging them to acknowledge that another viewpoint exists. That acknowledgement alone weakens the rigidity of the argument. It creates space for reflection, and reflection dissolves certainty. There is a deeper wisdom behind this question. Perspective-taking is a hallmark of intelligence. The ability to step outside oneself is the foundation of empathy, strategy, and truth-seeking. The person who can see from multiple angles is harder to deceive, harder to manipulate, and harder to provoke. And when you guide someone else into that mental territory, even briefly, you pull them out of emotional reaction and into cognitive awareness. Arguments survive on narrow frames. They collapse when the frame widens. When you ask someone how the opposite perspective would look, you widen their world. And once the world becomes larger, the argument becomes smaller. Question 5. What would happen if everyone applied your logic? This question is the final strike, the one that drags a person's belief out of the comfort of the present moment and forces it into the real world. Most arguments survive because they are kept small. They only have to make sense in the limited scenario someone is imagining. They never have to function on a larger scale. But when you take their idea and stretch it to its natural conclusion, when you place it in a world where everyone uses that same reasoning, the flaws begin to surface. Certainty cracks. The argument begins to shake. Because truth does not bend under universality, only illusions do. People think in the short term. They think in personal terms. They think in emotional terms. Someone might justify a lie because it didn't hurt anyone. Someone might justify inconsistency because it didn't matter this time. Someone might justify selfishness because they had a good reason. But when you ask, what would happen if everyone applied your logic? You remove them from the comfort of individuality. You make them confront the consequences of their reasoning, not just for themselves, but for the world they are implicitly endorsing. Imagine someone says, "I broke the rule because it wasn't a big deal." You ask, what would happen if everyone broke rules whenever they felt it wasn't a big deal? Suddenly, their personal convenience becomes societal decay. Their individual exception becomes collective erosion. The argument collapses, not because you argued harder, but because you revealed that their logic was only functional when they stood alone in it. This question exposes the difference between justification and principle. Justifications only work once. Principles must work always. And when someone realizes their reasoning cannot survive universality, they're forced to face the truth. They weren't defending a principle, they were defending a preference. They weren't talking about morality, they were talking about impulse. They weren't protecting truth, they were protecting ego. This question also reveals self-centered thinking. Most people argue from the assumption that their actions exist in isolation, as if the world adjusts to accommodate their convenience. But when they imagine everyone acting the same way, the illusion disappears. Their behavior can no longer hide behind personal context. It must now stand against the reality of human nature. And human nature magnifies everything, good or bad. What someone can justify privately becomes disastrous publicly. This realization disarms even the most confident debater. Consider a person who says, "I only cheated a little. It doesn't matter." Ask them what would happen if everyone cheated just a little. Trust dissolves. Systems break. Relationships corrode. The very social fabric they rely on collapses. In that moment, they're forced to confront the weight of their logic, the part they never considered because it didn't serve their immediate desire. This question is also incredibly effective in moral debates, because many moral claims are built on personal exceptions. A person might insist, people should be free to do whatever they want as long as they feel justified. But when you ask, what would happen if everyone followed that? The argument collapses under its own absurdity. Chaos emerges. Boundaries vanish. Harm becomes subjective. And the person realizes that morality cannot be built on personal impulses. It must be built on consistency. Another layer of this question lies in how it exposes contradictions. When someone applies their own logic universally, they often find that it contradicts another value they claim to hold. For example, a person might argue that cutting corners is acceptable if it benefits them. But when everyone cuts corners, the quality they depend on disappears. Now their argument turns against them. Their reasoning undermines their own interests. And once someone realizes they cannot live in the world their logic creates, their certainty is shattered. Use this question when a person relies on convenience-based logic, when they create exceptions for themselves, when they moralize inconsistently, or when they defend behavior that only works in isolation. Use it when someone refuses to consider consequences, when they argue emotionally rather than realistically, or when their reasoning depends on the assumption that they are the only person who matters. Ask it calmly, without tension. You're not accusing. You're not attacking. You are simply performing stress testing on their idea, stretching it across humanity and letting them see what breaks. And the moment they see it, the argument loses its power. They realize their logic cannot survive outside the bubble they built around it. This question does something remarkable. It forces people to see beyond themselves. It expands their thinking from the personal to the universal. It reveals the hidden selfishness behind many arguments. And it reminds them that truth is not measured by whether something feels right in the moment. Truth is measured by whether it can sustain the weight of universality. Laws, principles, and wisdom survive this test. Excuses do not. Once someone confronts the world created by their own logic, they understand the fragility of their reasoning. They see that their argument was small, temporary, and self-serving. And in that moment, they must choose. Cling to the illusion or step into awareness. Most people feel the shift instantly. They soften. They rethink. They reconsider. Not because you pushed them, but because their own logic, when mirrored back at them, revealed what they were avoiding. Arguments built on personal convenience cannot survive universal application. And when you ask what would happen if everyone applied the same logic, you expose the truth no one can ignore. A belief is only as strong as the world it creates. The power of these 5 questions is not in their complexity, but in their precision. They do what arguments fail to do. They reveal. They do what shouting fails to do. They clarify. They do what pride refuses to do. They open the mind. Anyone can speak loudly. Anyone can insist they are right. Anyone can defend a belief with force, emotion, or certainty. But very few people can withstand examination. Very few can walk backward through their reasoning without stumbling. Very few can see the foundation of their beliefs without feeling the ground shift beneath them. These questions expose the architecture of the mind, yours and theirs, and once that architecture is visible, illusions cannot survive. The truth is that most arguments do not collapse because they are defeated. They collapse because they were empty. They collapse because they were supported by assumptions, shortcuts, and emotional weight rather than evidence, clarity, or principle. When you use these questions, you're not overpowering anyone. You're uncovering what was already fragile. You're peeling away the layers of certainty until the person realizes they were standing on borrowed ground. And in that moment of realization, the argument dissolves. There is no need to fight. Illusion falls on its own. But there is a responsibility that comes with holding a tool this powerful. Questions can liberate, but they can also overwhelm. They can help someone grow, but they can also make them feel exposed. Not every moment is the right moment for clarity. Not every conversation is meant to be dissected. The wise person doesn't use these questions to dominate others. They use them to understand, and to help others understand themselves. Question asked with arrogance is an attack. Question asked with humility is a gift. And the difference lies not in the words, but in your intention. Use these questions to bring light, not humiliation. Use them to uncover truth, not to destroy confidence. And use them on yourself before you use them on anyone else. Ask yourself, what assumption am I relying on? What evidence would make me reconsider? How would this look from the opposite perspective? What world does my logic create? These questions, when applied inward, become a mirror. And mirrors are far more challenging than opponents. You cannot lie to yourself when your reasoning is laid bare. That is where growth begins. Not in winning arguments, but in understanding your own patterns. There is a quiet strength in the person who questions themselves. They become less reactive, more grounded, more aware. They stop fearing disagreement because disagreement becomes data. They stop fearing correction because correction becomes refinement. They stop fearing challenges because challenges become opportunities to sharpen their clarity. The more you question your own beliefs, the less tightly you cling to illusions. You become free from the need to prove anything. Free from the need to dominate. Free from the noise of emotion that distorts truth. And that freedom radiates through every conversation you enter. These questions also shield you from manipulation. Emotionally aggressive people lose their power when asked to explain themselves. Confident but unexamined voices lose their certainty when forced to articulate the foundation of their claims. Manipulators hate clarity because clarity removes their disguise. People who argue with intensity but without substance fall apart when faced with inquiry. You become unshakable not by resisting them, but by making them examine themselves. And self-examination is something most people avoid at all costs. There will be moments when someone becomes defensive, irritated, or uncomfortable when you use these questions. That reaction tells you everything. It tells you they are more attached to the argument than to the truth. It tells you they are protecting something fragile inside themselves. It tells you you've touched the boundary between honesty and illusion. When this happens, remain calm. Let silence do its work. Reflection grows in stillness, not noise. Your strength is not in pushing harder, but in holding steady while the truth unfolds. And understand this, the true purpose of these questions is not to win. It is to awaken. Arguments create distance. Questions create awareness. Arguments create resistance. Questions create possibility. Arguments try to change someone's position. Questions help someone change their own perspective. This is why the greatest thinkers in history used inquiry instead of force. They knew the mind opens from the inside, not from pressure applied from the outside. Your task is not to break others. It is to invite them into clarity. When you master these 5 questions, you will find that fewer conflicts escalate. Fewer conversations drain you. Fewer people can provoke you. You'll see arguments forming before they begin. You'll notice the assumptions beneath the surface. You'll recognize emotional reasoning disguised as logic. And you'll respond with patience instead of reaction. You'll find yourself becoming someone who doesn't need to prove anything, because truth does not need to shout. Truth simply needs space. And as you use these questions, you'll notice something else. People begin respecting you. Not because you dominate them, but because you understand them. Not because you win arguments, but because you elevate conversations. Not because you look powerful, but because you show clarity in a world drowning in noise. People are drawn to those who see clearly. They are drawn to those who think deeply. They are drawn to those who do not crumble under pressure or emotion. These questions shape that kind of person. If you've reached this point, then you're already among the few who value awareness over ego, growth over comfort, clarity over noise. So if this message resonated with you, if these questions open something inside you, leave a comment with the words, "I choose clarity." And before you go, like the video and subscribe. Not just to support the channel, but to continue building a mind that questions, observes, and understands the world with strength and precision. Because the one who learns to ask the right questions no longer fears any answer.